Thank you very much for your generous and warm welcome and greetings, and good afternoon to all of you. I would like to start as well by acknowledging the territory of the Musqueam peoples that we're gathered on here today, acknowledging as well the Tsleil-Waututh and the Squamish nations who are in this area and who have allowed us to gather at this place today. I want to thank Leah. Where did she go? Over there, she's run out. For the introduction, I want to thank Doug and the entire team at the First Nations Justice Council for your kindness and generosity in inviting me to join you here today for this very special occasion, to hear about the work that you're doing together, and to give me a few moments to make some comments. Of course, I'm honored to share this speaking time with my very dear friend and colleague, Jody Wilson-Raybould. I'm happy to be back in beautiful British Columbia. I had actually hoped to be here in January when I was Minister of Indigenous Services and had a trip that I was very much looking forward to that I had to cancel when I was shuffled to a different cabinet position and have not had the opportunity to come back to British Columbia until now. So thrilled to be here today. Thank you for asking me to speak at a Justice Council event. As you probably know, I'm not trained in the legal field, but I hope that I will have something to contribute to your discussions at this event as you study Indigenous justice, based on some of the observations I've made over the last number of years in particular, what I've learned about the daily lives of Indigenous peoples in this country and the serious socioeconomic injustices in particular that persist in our country. When Puglas was giving me some advice about what to say today, she said, people will want to know a little more about you. And I know many of you already, but not all of you know me particularly, so I thought I would share with you a little bit about my background. Some of you are familiar in particular with my political career, and particularly recently. I am proud of many other parts of my life, including the fact that I am a daughter and a sister and a wife and a mother of 4 adult children. I spent most of my working life as a family doctor, and my career was particularly shaped by the first 9 years of my medical career when I worked in the country of La République du Niger in West Africa. And it was there that I learned firsthand about the severe injustices of our global political structures. I was living and working in a country where at that time 27% of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. And I learned about the social injustices that span the globe and decided at that time that I wanted to spend the rest of my working life doing whatever I could to tip the balance toward greater fairness. Which brings us back to the issues that you're discussing today. And I thought I would use the time that I have to share with you some of what I learned when I was Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. I hope I will share some of the good news and positive progress that Canada has made in many of the areas, as well as, of course, the barriers that we face as a country. I was Canada's first Minister of Indigenous Services, and therefore had the opportunity to be able to shape some of the department policies based on what I learned as I met with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and leaders across the country. And on that basis, we chose 5 priority themes, each of which I'm going to touch upon very briefly today. The first priority was something that I heard you talking about when we joined you in the latter part of the morning session today, and that is the reformation of child welfare in this country, and it links very much to the work that you're doing. I knew that there was a lot of work to be done in this area, but I must say I was shocked when I learned more about the facts. I will never forget the first trip that I took as Minister of Indigenous Services when I went to Manitoba and was presented with information from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs based on research that they had done. I was shocked to learn that every single day in the province of Manitoba alone, every single day, an infant is apprehended from his or her parents, often before even leaving the hospital. I learned about the policy of birth alerts that sets up parents for failure rather than identifying families who might need support or providing them with the tools and resources that they need for successful parenting. I was told about the discriminatory policies that punish families for their poverty or their health issues by taking children away rather than addressing or trying to solve the underlying challenges that families face. But I also saw some very positive work being done by First Nations across the country. Here in British Columbia, in particular, I was blessed, for example, by the work and the teachings of Cookpee Christian, who has advocated for decades for the laws of his nation to be recognized, affirmed, and supported as they relate to caring for children. And Chief Christian and others supported me in ceremony and gave me the strength that I needed in order to carry the important messages of their communities back to Ottawa and to the Prime Minister. Earlier this morning, I heard Chief McLeod talking about the amazing work that they are doing in their community as well on transforming what child welfare looks like. I had the privilege of announcing resources to support some of the excellent work that's being done in British Columbia, including, for example, the exemplary work that's being done by leaders and social services workers in the Hwayet First Nation. I'm pleased to say that one of the results of this work was the tabling of a bill in the House of Commons, C-92. It is a response to the direct call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission number 4 that there should be federal legislation as it relates to child welfare. The piece of legislation that was tabled by the Minister O'Regan, who followed me, is a strong piece of legislation. It contains important provisions associated with the recognition of rights. And its strength would not be what it is were it not for the work of someone else in this room, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafont, and I don't know where Mary Ellen is sitting. Mary Ellen is one of the unrecognized heroes of this work. You all know her reputation in this area. She was the chair of the legislative working group that did the magic of pulling together a whole range of recommendations, and I thank her for that. The bill is not perfect. It has been criticized in particular for its absence of statutory funding. And so the government has some important decisions ahead, and I believe that there are opportunities yet to strengthen this legislation even more, and I hope to do what I can in that area. As it relates to your larger theme of First Nations justice strategy, one cannot overemphasize the importance of dramatic reform in the recognition of rights in child welfare. I don't need to convince anyone in this room that the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare system is directly linked to the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in rates of homelessness, missing persons, suicide, homicide, problematic substance use, incarceration, human trafficking, and more. You know better than I the critical importance of children growing up in their own culture, surrounded by their land, their language, their lineage. So many of your communities are doing good work to make this the reality, but federal and provincial governments are still not sufficiently seized with the urgent need for reform. The second priority area for work in Indigenous services is education, and I won't spend a lot of time on this issue, although it is, of course, critical. As in many areas, BC First Nations, along with the province, have been leading the way. I'm delighted to know that after months of hard work, the second BC Tripartite Education Agreement was signed in January. That's what I was supposed to get to do, but didn't get to at the last minute. But I'm glad it was signed. And finally, across the country, we can say that as of now, funding for First Nation students on reserve is as good as or better than provincial funding systems. But that is not to say that there are not massive gaps that remain. In particular, I have been shocked to discover the gaps in educational infrastructure, with hundreds of schools on reserve in need of major investments. When students from Kashechewan First Nation in Northern Ontario came to Ottawa last year, and I learned about the facilities in which 400 children were receiving their education, I was aghast. Their school consisted, and still to this day consists, of moldy portables in which the doors won't close, and there are holes in the floor, and there are no recreational facilities. It is unconscionable that any family in this country should be expected to accept such conditions. And worse still, that there is no system under which alarm bells are sounded to alert the department of the desperate need for intervention. Happily, we did manage to secure $15 million to make sure that they have a temporary modular school that will be ready for September until a longer-term solution can be built. The third department priority was health. Here again, BC has led the way with the work of the BC First Nations Health Authority, which is now a model for other regions who are slowly working toward self-determination in health services. The BC First Nations Health Authority has been a model to demonstrate the important links by which the recognition of rights is the foundation for addressing the social determinants of health, which in turn are the foundation for improving public health and primary care, which in turn will lead to better health outcomes. I know it's not perfect, but your communities deserve credit for showing the rest of the country what can happen when First Nations are in charge. And I should commend the entire BC First Nations Health Council. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Evan Adams and others at the Health Authority for the impressive leadership that they have shown in an important area of educating health professionals in the area of cultural safety and cultural competence. This is now being modeled across the country and is essential for addressing the very serious challenges of stigma and discrimination against First Nations that exist in health systems across this country. There's another related area within the health domain where I would like to see us push ourselves much harder, and that is in the training of Indigenous health professionals. I've been trying to push for a commitment to revive one of the recommendations from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, written in 1996, which called for the training of 10,000 Indigenous health professionals in Canada over 10 years. Governments tend to do better when they set clear goals for themselves, and I think this is something that we could push both federal and provincial governments to collaborate upon. Within the topic of health, like education, there are disturbing infrastructure gaps that we need to keep fighting to address. One of the worst examples hit the news again recently, and that is the need for a treatment centre in Grassy Narrows in Ontario. I hope you will join me in calling on Canada to follow through with the commitment that I made to this community in the fall of 2017. No doubt you are familiar with the terrible history of industrial mercury contamination that goes back now for more than half a century. And this community has been asking for an on-reserve health facility in which to care in particular for people with chronic needs and serious health issues associated with mercury contamination. I want you to consider that our country now has annual federal spending of $350 billion a year. That's 12 figures, $350 billion. If we cannot assure the community of Grassy Narrows that we as a country will find a way to support the construction of a health facility that will cost something in the order of $10 to $20 million, then our moral compass is very much in need of a reset. You're getting the message, as if you didn't already know this, that infrastructure is a huge need across the country for First Nations, both on and off reserve. It turns out that this is the fourth area of priority for Indigenous Services of Canada, and I know many of you are in particular concerned in this area, of course, for the needs in urban areas. But you may also know that the estimated infrastructure gap on reserve is estimated to be about $40 billion, and it grows by about $1 billion each year. The country still lacks a proper plan to address this gap, despite significant new investments, which means that there's a great need for creative solutions in the area of policy, funding, training, and the creation of First Nations institutions and more. Housing on reserve is probably the most critical need to address. On this, I have been shocked and saddened by what I have seen across this country. For generations, Canada has been content to spend a bare minimum amount of money to build what has been described by some as, quote, disposable homes on reserve, end quote. In remote communities that are full of stunning natural resources of rocks and trees, where strong, intelligent people of all ages remain untrained and unemployed, for decades, we have shipped in ugly boxes made of cheap synthetic materials to sprinkle that landscape with buildings that aren't durable, don't inspire pride of ownership, don't express any regard for beauty or tradition or culture. These boxes passing for homes don't last. They aren't adequately serviced with plumbing and basic facilities, and they become moldy, crowded, and unhealthy, both physically and mentally. Thankfully, that is not always the case. I have seen stunning examples of what is possible, including, for example, the beautiful traditional roundhouses that I saw last year in Skeetchson First Nation. But there's not nearly enough funding or support, let alone the policies, to facilitate new approaches to housing and infrastructure. I've also seen some very creative ways to fund housing in urban areas, including communities who are solving housing problems while simultaneously bringing families together by using provincial funds that would have otherwise gone to paying foster families, and use those funds instead to pay for reuniting families and providing their housing needs and other social services. Let's do more of that. One more comment before I move on from infrastructure. I need to give a special acknowledgement to some of the incredible work of rebuilding that is taking place in this province in response to the terrible devastation of the wildfires of 2017 and 2018. I had the incredible privilege in November of visiting the absolutely beautiful Tahltan First Nation, and in particular Telegraph Creek. I can't tell you how impressed I was not only by the surroundings, the devastation caused by the wildfires, but also the leadership in this community of Chief Rick McLean and his team, who have been working nonstop to see their community restored and find ways that people can return home. I have to give a shout out to so many others. I think for example, of the work of the First Nations Summit, Grand Chief Ed John, Cheryl Casmer, and so many others who have been tireless advocates, along with the entire BC First Nations Leadership Council, on the proper investment that needs to be made in emergency response, including the critical need for funding for prevention and mitigation of the disasters of fires and flooding that have proved so devastating in your province in recent years. The last priority area for Indigenous services is the focus on economic prosperity. And I won't go into great detail here because we're running out of time. But you know that there is much more that governments could and should be doing to support in this area. For example, I hope you will continue to advocate for more access to capital, which can make a huge difference to communities who are and provide a major return on investment for governments as well. One of my favorite initiatives in the economic portfolio of the department was the vision of the work of people like Harold Calla and others at the First Nations Financial Management Board, as well as others in the First Nations fiscal institutions, in order to enable about 100 communities to have 10-year grants that started just a few weeks ago, in order to provide stable, predictable, flexible funding. Now, I know some have criticized this vision, saying that it potentially prolongs the colonial financial relationships under the Indian Act, and of course, improving the fiscal relationship with Canada requires the fulsome recognition of rights. But in the process of getting there, the opportunity to have long-term grants should not be underestimated as a tool to support the path to self-determination and self-government. In a similar way, some helpful work has been done to expedite processes, for example, associated with additions to reserve, that are still undertaken within colonial political structures, but could at least be improved upon in the short term. Ultimately, of course, the only way to economic prosperity, not to mention justice, is to fight for the recognition and affirmation of Indigenous rights and title. You know only too well that such recognition constitutes the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Well, that has been a quick overview of some of what I worked on for the 16 months that I was Minister of Indigenous Services. In some ways, I believe we made progress and we pushed for essential improvements in federal services, but there is much more to be done. How can we do better together? Your work on justice is probably the most important work of all, because it must transform the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. In the meantime, I believe that we must continue to push for the full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the TRC calls to action. There's much more work to be done to educate Canadians about the truth, the history of this land. As a person who was educated in Canada, I'm ashamed of how little I understood about Canada's colonial past. And I've had an enormous privilege over the last 4 years to learn from so many of you, along with other First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in this country. Of course, I've also had the extraordinary privilege of learning from my friend, the one and only Puglas, who taught me by her words and by her actions how we need to move forward as a country to right the wrongs of our collective past and create a path forward, somehow finding a way to live together in peace and harmony. We have a long way to go to convince all Canadians of the urgent need for reconciliation. There has been progress in the past 4 years, but not nearly enough. I don't know what my own future holds from the point of view of politics or career, but I will always be an ally in fighting for the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples. The future of our country depends on getting this right. Finally, I will make a very brief comment on the challenges of recent months in order to thank you, all of you, for your incredible support and encouragement. The political shockwaves that hit Ottawa over the SNC-Lavalin case have been examined from many angles. One of the underlying lessons that some observers have noted is that there was a serious clash of cultures. In theory, there is a desire for diversity among people in politics. In reality, it seems that Ottawa is not entirely ready for people who approach leadership and responsibility from different worldviews. As a result, some voices were not heard or were not understood. And some have criticized me and Jody as being naive, as not understanding how things are done. Those critics failed to realize that the way things have always been done may not meet the standard of what Canadians expect from their political leaders. I'm exceedingly sad about how the circumstances unfolded, but I believe that someday we will look back at this year and we will see that our democracy has been strengthened because people stood up for its fundamental foundations. In the meantime, for my part, I hope to model the lessons I learned from some of you, lessons on how to be resilient and how to persevere. There is much more to learn and more to do. I will not forget what I've learned from Indigenous leaders, elders, women, and youth in BC and across the country. I will not give up on the fight for justice and equity within and beyond our borders, and I know that you won't either. Thank you for the work you do every day to make our country and our planet more fair for everyone. Merci beaucoup.